"We'll put out an alert," the officer promised. Boat thefts aren't uncommon, but they usually target vessels that can be quickly transported out of the area. A 28-foot whaler is pretty conspicuous. As the officer left, Mike noticed Tommy, the 16-year-old son of a neighbor who often helped with marina maintenance on weekends, watching from the fuel dock. "Tommy, you're here early," Mike called out, jogging over to the teen. "Any chance you've seen my boat?" Tommy shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if checking who might be listening. "Mr. Thompson, I wasn't going to say anything because, well, she's the HOA president and all, but," he lowered his voice, "Mrs. Caldwell took your boat out yesterday afternoon." Mike felt his blood pressure spike. "She did what?" "She had a bunch of ladies with her, all dressed fancy. They had those big sun hats and were carrying coolers of champagne and stuff." Tommy pulled out his phone. "Actually, I took a picture because it seemed weird. Mrs. Caldwell was wearing this captain's hat and telling everyone she was an experienced boater." The photo on Tommy's phone showed Diane at the helm of his boat, posing dramatically in a ridiculous oversized captain's hat with gold braiding, surrounded by 4 other women holding champagne flutes. They were clearly still docked in the photo, the marina office visible in the background. Mike's hands shook with anger as he drove to Diane's waterfront mansion, easily the largest home in the community. Her husband, a perpetually nervous-looking man whom residents rarely saw, answered the door in golf attire. "Where is she?" Mike demanded without preamble. I'm sorry, who?" the man stammered, though his eyes showed immediate understanding. "Your wife. She took my boat. That's theft." The man's shoulders sagged. "She's not here. She took her friends from the Oceanside Country Club out for a ladies' maritime excursion." Her words, not mine. He lowered his voice. "She said the HOA bylaws allow for temporary reassignment of violating property. I told her it sounded illegal, but you know Diane, once she gets an idea." "Where did they go?" Mike enunciated each word clearly. "Seafarers Cove. They left about 2 hours ago. Something about a champagne lunch and showing off the boat to her club friends." He hesitated. "She's been practicing boat terminology all week." Mike made 2 calls during his drive south along the coastal highway. The first was to his friend Carter, a retired Coast Guard officer who now ran fishing charters. The second was to the Coast Guard station directly. "Let me get this straight," the Coast Guard dispatcher said. "You're reporting your own boat as stolen." "Yes. It was taken without permission by someone with no boating experience, no license, likely intoxicated, with passengers aboard, headed towards Seafarers Cove." "Do you know the individuals on board?" "The woman who took it is my HOA president. She has no authorization to use my vessel and has never had any boating training to my knowledge." 20 minutes later, Mike's phone rang. It was Carter. "I just heard the Coast Guard radio chatter," his friend said. "They spotted your whaler approaching Seafarers Cove, moving in an erratic pattern." Their words, not mine. Mike Thompson had lived in Sunset Harbor for nearly 3 years, drawn to the small coastal community for its pristine waters and exclusive marina. His neighbors often joked that his 28-foot Boston whaler received more maintenance than most people's homes. And they weren't entirely wrong. The boat represented years of hard work and sacrifice, a gleaming testament to his passion for the open water. When Diane Caldwell's black Mercedes SUV first rolled into the community 6 months ago, few residents took notice. Within weeks, however, everyone knew her name, or rather, the nickname they whispered when she turned her back, HOA Karen. Despite being the newest resident, Diane had somehow maneuvered her way into the HOA presidency through a special election that had suspiciously low turnout. Another notice? Mike's neighbor Jeff called out from his garage as Mike stared at the hot pink citation taped to his front door. "What's she got you for this time?" Mike ripped the notice off the door, his expression darkening as he read. "Apparently my boat is improperly docked and poses a community hazard. That'll be $150, due immediately." Jeff whistled. "That's the 3rd boat citation this week. Davis got one for having a fishing rod visible from the dock, and Maria got fined because her boat registration sticker was supposedly 1 centimeter too far to the left. Mike pulled out his phone and scrolled through his gallery, finding the photos he'd taken just that morning, a habit he'd developed specifically because of Diane's reputation. The images clearly showed his boat perfectly secured in slit number 17, with proper line tension and bumpers perfectly positioned. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, dialing Diane's number. When she answered, her voice held the artificial sweetness that everyone in the community had learned to dread. "Sunset Harbor HOA. President Caldwell speaking. Diane, it's Mike Thompson. There's been a mistake with this boat citation." "There's no mistake, Mr. Thompson," she interrupted, the sweetness evaporating instantly. "I personally inspected all vessels this morning. The bow line was slack, creating a potential hazard during tidal changes. I have time-stamped photos from this morning showing." "Photos can be manipulated, Mr. Thompson. My documentation stands. The fine is $150, due by Friday, or it increases to $300. Is there anything else?" The call ended before Mike could respond. He looked over at Jeff, who was shaking his head sympathetically. "You know," Jeff said quietly, "rumor has it she's never even been on a boat. Apparently, she gets seasick just looking at water ripples." Dawn broke over Sunset Harbor with the promise of perfect fishing conditions, light winds, clear skies, and reports of yellowfin running just beyond the breakwater. Mike arrived at the marina just after sunrise, cooler packed with ice and sandwiches, his lucky fishing cap pulled low against the morning glare. The sight of empty water where his Boston whaler should have been hit him like a physical blow. "No, no, no," he muttered, dropping his cooler and rushing to the edge of slit number 17. The dock lines weren't broken. They were simply gone, along with his boat. His first panicked thought was that it had somehow come loose, but Mike knew better. Those knots would have held through a hurricane. His second thought turned his panic to dread: theft. Within 20 minutes, a young police officer was taking notes while Mike paced the dock. "Registration numbers, hull ID, electronic serial numbers. I have everything documented," Mike explained, handing over a meticulous file he kept for insurance purposes. "She fined me $200 because my garbage can remain at the curb 4 hours after collection," an elderly resident explained. "My wife had fallen that morning, and I spent the day in the ER with her. I received a violation notice because my garden hose was visible from the street," another added. Meanwhile, her friends from the country club parked their cars on their lawns during parties with no consequences. When it was Mike's turn, he simply played a recording from his security camera, installed after his third questionable HOA citation, showing Diane entering his boat at the marina before her excursion. "All I'll say is that a vessel registered solely to me was taken without permission," he stated calmly. "The Coast Guard and Sheriff's Department are handling the rest." By the time the vote of no confidence was called, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. Diane was removed from the board by a vote of 87-3, with the only supporting votes coming from her country club friends. As residents filed out, Mike found himself approached by at least a dozen neighbors who shared similar stories of Diane's selective enforcement. Tommy's father clapped him on the shoulder. "My boy's applying to Maritime Academy next year," he said. "He was impressed by how you handled this, said it was a lesson in standing up for what's right." 2 weeks later, a for sale sign appeared in front of Diane's house. The sign vanished a few days later, replaced by printed flyers stapled to the post. Neighbors walking by could clearly read the sheriff's notice explaining that the property was subject to a lien pending resolution of criminal and civil proceedings. Mike continued his weekend fishing trips from slip number 17, his boat now fully restored after the Diane incident, as residents called it. The new HOA board, led by Helen, had revised the bylaws to clarify enforcement procedures and require documentation for all violation notices. On a perfect Saturday morning 3 months later, as Mike prepared to cast off, he noticed an unfamiliar woman walking tentatively down the dock. "Excuse me," she called out. "Are you Mike Thompson, with the Boston whaler?" Mike nodded cautiously. "I'm Louise Caldwell, Diane's sister." She looked embarrassed. "I just wanted to apologize for what happened. My sister has always had issues with authority and boundaries. Our family is covering the damages to your boat and the legal fees. Mike considered this for a moment. I appreciate that. How is she doing? Louise sighed. Mandatory boating safety classes and community service. And therapy, finally. She glanced around the marina. It's a beautiful boat, by the way. Thanks, Mike said. Would you like to see it? Properly this time? Louise smiled. I'd like that. But unlike my sister, I'll wait for an invitation. As Mike helped Louise aboard for a brief tour, he couldn't help but reflect on the irony. Diane's need to control everything had cost her everything, while his simple love of boating and commitment to doing things right had ultimately brought justice, and perhaps even a measure of healing, to the entire community. The next weekend, several neighbors joined Mike for his fishing trip, and when they returned with their catch, the new HOA president was waiting at the dock, not with a citation, but with a cold beer and congratulations on a successful day on the water. Mike's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Erratic how? Let's just say they're not maintaining a consistent course or speed. The guard's intercepting now. I called my buddy at Seafarers Marina. They're holding slip B12 for you. No charge. When Mike arrived at Seafarers Cove, he couldn't have scripted a better scene if he tried. His Boston whaler was flanked by a Coast Guard vessel, lights flashing. On the main dock, Diane stood red-faced in her captain's hat and nautical striped outfit that looked fresh off a department store mannequin, gesturing dramatically while a stone-faced Coast Guard officer wrote on a clipboard. Her 4 friends sat miserably on a nearby bench, their ladies' maritime excursion clearly having lost its charm. One was discreetly vomiting into a trash can. "Sir, are you Michael Thompson?" the Coast Guard officer asked as Mike approached. "Yes, that's my boat," Mike confirmed, performing a quick visual inspection. Even from a distance, he could see scuff marks along the starboard side that hadn't been there before. "Mike," Diane's voice cut through the marina like a foghorn. "Tell them this is all a misunderstanding. As HOA president, I have every right to confiscate and utilize community property when rules are violated." The Coast Guard officer, whose nameplate read Lieutenant Santos, raised an eyebrow. "Sir, can you verify that this vessel is privately owned and registered to you alone?" Mike produced his registration and insurance documents. "It's my personal property, bought with my own money, and has never been community property in any way." Lieutenant Santos nodded. "Mrs. Caldwell, as I've been explaining, operating a vessel without the owner's permission is unauthorized use at minimum, grand theft at worst. Additionally, you have no boater's license, were operating erratically, had open containers of alcohol aboard while operating, and had insufficient safety equipment for your passengers." One of Diane's friends suddenly stood up. "You told us this was your boat, Diane. You said you were an experienced boater." Diane's face, already flushed, turned a dangerous shade of purple. "Technically, as HOA president." "There is no technically about it," Lieutenant Santos interrupted. "The law is clear. Now, in addition to these citations, the Sheriff's Department will want to speak with you about the unauthorized use of the vessel." A young Coast Guard officer approached, looking uncomfortable. "Lieutenant, you should see this." He held out a phone, displaying what appeared to be a social media post. Lieutenant Santos looked at the screen, then at Diane. "Mrs. Caldwell, did you post these photos an hour ago with the caption, 'Living my best boat life on my new toy'?" The emergency HOA meeting the following Tuesday broke all attendance records. Residents who had never shown up to a single meeting arrived early to secure seats. The community room packed beyond capacity, with folding chairs lining the walls. Diane sat at the board table, her usual imperious demeanor notably absent. Beside her, the HOA vice president, a retired judge named Helen, called the meeting to order. "Before we address recent events," Helen began, "I should inform everyone that our HOA attorney has advised Mrs. Caldwell not to comment on the pending criminal investigation." A murmur swept through the crowd. "Criminal?" someone called out. "What happened to a citation?" Mike, who sat quietly in the back row, had already heard from Lieutenant Santos that the situation had escalated. Not only had Diane taken the boat without permission, but the social media posts claiming ownership constituted intent, upgrading the offense significantly. Helen cleared her throat. We've called this emergency meeting to address concerns about HOA leadership and to review certain interpretations of our bylaws. What followed was 2 hours of resident testimony that painted a pattern so clear it couldn't be ignored. Dozens of homeowners described arbitrary fines, rules that weren't in the actual bylaws, and selective enforcement that seemed to target certain residents while ignoring Diane's friends.